History tells us the sky is silent, that the stars above us are distant, mechanical, and indifferent. But 5,000 years ago, beneath a night far darker than anything we know today, someone in ancient Sumer paused while writing because the sky no longer behaved the way it was supposed to. Imagine the land between the rivers, long before cities of glass and light. The air is still warm from the day, but cooling fast. The ground holds the memory of heat. Somewhere nearby, the Euphrates moves slowly, reflecting the stars so clearly that sky and water seem to merge into one endless surface. There is no electric hum, no distant engines, only insects, wind, and silence. At the top of a stepped temple, a man kneels beside a low oil lamp. In his hands is a lump of fresh clay, in his other a reed stylus. He is not a poet, he is not a prophet, he is a watcher. His task is simple: look up, record what moves. For generations, men like him have done the same thing. They have memorized the sky so completely that any deviation stands out instantly. The fixed stars rise when expected. The moon follows its measured path. The wandering lights, what we now call planets, drift forward, slow, reverse, and continue on again. Nothing surprises them anymore. Until tonight. Something appears where it should not be. It does not follow the familiar loops. It does not respect the ancient lanes of the sky. It crosses through them. The scribe hesitates. He presses the stylus into clay anyway, marking a position carefully, methodically, without emotion. He does not name it. He does not speculate. He only records what is seen. This is how history actually begins, not with belief, but with observation. Tonight we are going to return to that moment, slowly, carefully, without fear. Over the next hours we will move through ancient observatories, broken clay tablets, and modern trajectory maps to understand why a phenomenon we have recently named Three-Eye Atlas feels strangely familiar to a civilization that vanished thousands of years ago. As you listen, you don't need to do anything. You don't need to analyze or remember. Just let the words drift like stars overhead. Somewhere in the world, you are listening right now. Maybe lying down. Maybe with the lights low. Maybe while the night settles outside your window. If you feel like it later, when you wake, you can leave a quiet note about where and how you listened. Not to start a conversation, just to mark that this moment existed. Now imagine the sky above ancient Babylon. No glow on the horizon, no satellites, only darkness and points of light so sharp they feel close enough to touch. This was not a people who guessed at the heavens. This was a people who lived beneath them. In Sumer, power did not come from armies alone. It came from prediction, to know when the river would rise, when the moon would darken, when the seasons would turn. The ruler, the priest, and the astronomer were often the same person. To misread the sky was not an error, it was a failure of survival. Night after night, watchers climbed temple steps carrying clay and reeds. They stood in the open air and mapped the heavens, not as myth, but as schedule. The sky was divided into paths, zones, lanes through which celestial bodies were expected to move. Order mattered. They knew which stars never moved. They knew which lights wandered but returned. They even knew how to recognize rare visitors like comets, streaking briefly before dissolving into legend. But the object recorded that night did none of those things. It did not streak and vanish. It did not loop and return. It crossed. The ancient language had a word for such crossings, not a name, a function, a marker, a point where established paths intersected. It was not described as a destroyer, not a god, not a weapon. It was simply noted. And then the sky returned to normal. Years passed, decades. Dynasties rose and fell. The clay tablet dried, was stored, copied, broken, buried and forgotten beneath dust and collapsed walls. The city itself was eventually reclaimed by sand. The visitor never returned, until modern instruments began to notice something strange. In the quiet halls of contemporary observatories, long after the sky was assumed fully mapped, a new object appeared, not bound to the sun, not originating within the familiar architecture of our system. Its speed was wrong, its angle was wrong, its trajectory cut across the planetary plane instead of orbiting within it. Scientists labelled it efficiently, dispassionately, 3I. The third known interstellar object, Atlas. No myth, no meaning, just classification, and yet its path mirrored something written down 5,000 years earlier by a man kneeling beside an oil lamp, not because he understood what it was, but because he understood that it did not belong. If this journey helps you find rest tonight, you don't need to do anything in return. Let the video play. Let the night pass. You are safe here. In the next part of this story, we will move gently forward in time. We will look at what modern astronomy knows about objects like 3I Atlas, why they are so rare, and why their behaviour feels unsettlingly deliberate without ever needing to invoke fear. For now, let the clay tablet rest in the dark, let the stars drift overhead, and let your breathing slow, as it did for the watchers of Uruk, who understood that the sky does not need to speak loudly to be heard. The watcher does not look away from the sky after making the mark. He waits. That was the discipline taught in the temple schools. A single observation was never enough. A deviation had to be confirmed, placed against the rhythm of nights, tested against memory. The sky was not trusted casually, it was verified. The oil lamp flickers beside him, its flame bending slightly in a warm current of air. Below the ziggurat, the city sleeps. Clay walls hold the day's heat, dogs shift in alleyways. Somewhere a reed flute sighs once and then falls quiet. Above, the unfamiliar light continues its steady movement. It does not shimmer like a comet. It does not pulse like a star low on the horizon. It does not flare and fade. It moves with a patience that feels intentional, crossing regions of the sky that were never meant to intersect. The watcher recognizes the violation immediately, not emotionally, but structurally. This object does not belong to any of the three great paths the Sumerians divided the heavens into. It ignores the way of Enlil, the way of Anu, the way of E. Those divisions were not symbolic. They were functional. They were celestial highways. This thing is cutting across them. In later centuries, scholars would misunderstand this. They would translate the ancient word as a name, a thing, a god, a monster. But originally it was not a noun. It was a description of behaviour, a crossing. That distinction matters. The ancient sky watchers were not storytellers in the modern sense. They did not mythologize first and explain later. They catalogued first. Myth came afterward, when memory outlived precision. Tonight, precision still holds. The watcher presses another mark into the clay, then another. The spacing between them is exact. Time measured not by clocks, but by breath, by heartbeat, by the slow passage of stars that should not move, but do. This tablet will not be displayed. It will not be read aloud in ritual. It will be placed among thousands of others in storage rooms beneath the temple. It will be one data point among generations of sky, and that is why it survives, because it was never meant to impress. As centuries pass, the city of Uruk changes. Kings add inscriptions boasting of victories. Temples expand. Walls rise higher. The language shifts. The old signs are copied less carefully. New scribes rely on tradition instead of direct observation. Eventually, the watchers stop climbing the steps as often. The sky, it seems, has settled, but clay remembers. Millennia later, long after the last priest has left the temple precinct, long after the ziggurat has collapsed into a low hill. Men with notebooks and measuring tools arrive from far away. They speak languages unknown to the land. They dig not for gold, but for fragments. They find broken tablets, incomplete lines, signs whose meaning must be reconstructed piece by piece. Among them are astronomical lists, catalogues of stars, schedules of risings and settings, and anomalies. One line does not fit. It describes a body that does not conform to the patterns around it, a movement that does not repeat, a crossing without return. For a long time, this line is ignored. Scholars assume error, scribal mistake, damaged text, mythical embellishment. The human mind prefers order, and when evidence threatens order, is often dismissed quietly. The tablet is shelved. Decades pass, then centuries, and then, without warning, the modern sky produces something equally inconvenient. In 2017, the first interstellar visitor is detected. It moves too fast. It does not orbit the sun. It is passing through. It is given a Hawaiian name meaning messenger from afar. Scientists are intrigued but calm. One anomaly does not rewrite the rules. Then another arrives, and then another. By the time 3i Atlas is detected, the language begins to shift. This one is different. Its speed is unusual, but not unprecedented. Its origin is clearly outside the solar system, but its trajectory is what raises quiet concern. It is not merely passing through randomly. It is intersecting the plane in which planets orbit, the ecliptic, the same middle path the Sumerians mapped with obsessive care. This is where the ancient and the modern touch, not in prophecy, in geometry. In Babylon, the sky was not divided arbitrarily. The middle path mattered because it was where change happened. Eclipses, planetary reversals, omens were read not because they were mystical, but because deviation meant consequence. Crops failed. Floods came early. Kings fell. The watchers were not predicting fate. They were managing risk. So when the ancient tablet describes a star that crosses the middle, it is not announcing disaster. It is signalling attention. Something is moving where movement is rare. Modern astronomers say the same thing in different words. An interstellar object has entered the ecliptic plane. No superstition, no fear, just data that refuses to be ignored. If you imagine the solar system as a quiet lake, planets move like ripples on its surface. Interstellar objects usually skim past, touching the edges. But something that cuts through the centre disturbs the whole pattern. This does not mean intent. It means consequence. And consequence is what ancient astronomy was built to observe. The Mol-Apin tablets, often misunderstood as mythic star lore, are in fact some of the most rigorous observational records ever produced without telescopes. They distinguish fixed stars from wanderers. They record heliacal risings. They track cycles across generations. They were not written by dreamers. They were written by bureaucrats of the sky, which makes the anomaly more unsettling. Because bureaucrats do not invent anomalies. They document them. 3i Atlas does not accelerate like a rocket. It does not broadcast signals. It does not glow unnaturally. There is no drama in its behaviour, and that is precisely why it commands attention. Its motion is clean, unemotional, unconcerned. It passes through our system the way a traveller crosses a city square, indifferent to who notices. And yet, 5,000 years ago, someone noticed. As you listen, you don't need to decide what this means. Meaning is heavy. Meaning wakes the mind. Tonight is not for answers, it is for alignment, for letting patterns exist without forcing them into belief. Imagine again the desert night, the watcher's breath, the clay tablet cooling in his hands. He did not ask why the star crossed the middle. He only ensured that someone, someday, would know that it did. And now, lying beneath a different sky with different instruments, we are doing the same thing, watching, recording, letting the visitor pass. In the next part of our journey, we will slow down even further. We will take apart the anatomy of this modern object, piece by piece, and compare its quiet behaviour to the ancient language that described such crossings long before science had a name for them. For now, rest. The sky is wide, the night is long, and the watchers are still at their posts, whether they know it or not. The modern watcher does not climb a ziggurat. They sit in a control room, light from monitors washing over their hands instead of firelight. The air is cooled artificially. Time is measured by atomic clocks. The sky arrives not as silence, but as data, and yet the posture is the same. Eyes fixed, breath slowed, waiting for deviation. When 3-Eye Atlas enters the datasets, it does not announce itself loudly. There is no sudden spike that sets alarms ringing across observatories. Instead, it appears first as a disagreement. One instrument suggests a trajectory that another cannot reconcile. The numbers refuse to settle into a familiar orbit. Models are adjusted, assumptions are checked, calibration is repeated. Still, the object does not behave. This is often how discovery begins, not with wonder, but with irritation. Astronomy, like ancient sky watching, is built on expectation. The solar system is orderly. Even chaos follows equations. When something violates those equations, the instinct is not excitement, it is suspicion of error. So the early discussion around 3-Eye Atlas is cautious. It is labelled interstellar because its velocity exceeds what the sun can capture. That alone places it outside the family. But interstellar does not mean rare. The galaxy is full of debris. Stars shed material. Systems exchange fragments. What matters is not where it comes from. It is how it moves once it arrives. Most interstellar objects pass through on hyperbolic paths that glance off the solar system like stones skipping water. Their trajectories are steep. Their time here is brief. They do not linger near the plane where planets live. 3-Eye Atlas does. Its path brings it close to the ecliptic, not perfectly aligned, but close enough to raise eyebrows, close enough to require explanation, close enough to echo an ancient phrase that was never meant to survive translation. The star that crosses the middle. In modern terms, crossing the ecliptic is not forbidden. Objects do it. Comets do it. Asteroids do it. But comets announce themselves with tails. Asteroids follow families. Their origins can be traced statistically, if not individually. 3-Eye Atlas resists that comfort. Spectroscopic analysis reveals nothing exotic, no clear outgassing plume, no unmistakable cometary signature. Its brightness fluctuates slightly, but not in a way that screams activity. It is, frustratingly, normal, and yet it accelerates, not dramatically, not in a way that violates physics outright, but enough to require additional forces in the models. Solar radiation pressure is considered, outgassing is reconsidered. The equations stretch to accommodate the behaviour. They can, but only just. Here is where modern science mirrors ancient caution. No one leaps to conclusions. No one invokes intent. The language remains dry, conservative, responsible. But language, even careful language, carries weight. Non-gravitational acceleration, anomalous trajectory, unmodelled forces. These are not declarations. They are placeholders for ignorance. 5,000 years ago, the watcher would have made a similar mental note. Not panic, not reverence, just acknowledgement that the pattern has been interrupted. The ancient sky was not interpreted emotionally. Omens were not punishments. They were indicators. A flood did not happen. because the gods were angry. The gods were angry because a flood was coming. This distinction is subtle, but essential. So when we ask whether 3-Psi Atlas is predicted, we are asking the wrong question. The Sumerians did not predict specific objects. They predicted categories of motion, behaviours that repeated over cosmic timescales. They understood that the sky was not static, but cyclical, and cycles include visitors. The word later translated as Nibiru does not originally name a planet. It names a function, a crossing point, a moment of transition, a marker where paths intersect. In administrative texts, the same root word is used for ferries, for legal thresholds, for gates. It means passage. Nothing more, nothing less. This is why later apocalyptic interpretations fail so badly. They impose narrative where the original texts offered structure. They demand drama where the ancient watchers offered bookkeeping. 3i Atlas does not herald doom, nor does it promise salvation. It simply crosses. And crossings in ancient thinking mattered because they aligned events, agricultural cycles, political instability, climatic shifts, not because the sky caused them, but because the same underlying rhythms governed all systems. Modern science would phrase this differently. We would speak of resonance, of coupled systems, of chaos theory. But the intuition is identical. A small change in initial conditions can ripple outward. The watcher in Uruk did not know about gravitational perturbations, but he knew that when the middle path was disturbed, something elsewhere would answer. So the tablet recorded the crossing, and the tablet survived. As the nights pass, modern observatories refine their measurements. The object recedes. Its window of observation narrows. It does not slow. It does not turn. It does not acknowledge us. It leaves the way it arrived, quietly. And that quiet is perhaps the most unsettling feature of all, because noise reassures us that something is happening. Silence forces us to sit with uncertainty. If you are listening as you rest, let this uncertainty remain gentle. There is no revelation coming, no sudden answer waiting at the end of the night. Only continuity, a line of watchers stretching across millennia, each doing the same small act, looking up, writing down, letting the sky be larger than their understanding. In the next movement of our journey, we will step away from the object itself and return to the stories that grew around crossings, stories that transformed geometry into myth and motion into memory, not to prove them true, but to understand why they endured. For now, allow the numbers to fade. The star has passed, the record remains, and the night continues, steady and vast, exactly as it always has. The endurance of a record is rarely about accuracy alone. If it were, most ancient texts would have vanished entirely, replaced by newer calculations, better instruments, clearer models. Instead, certain fragments persist long after their practical usefulness has faded. They survive not because they solved a problem, but because they framed a question that could not be closed. The crossing was one of those questions. In later centuries, long after the last Sumerian city had been absorbed into newer empires, scribes continued to copy star lists whose original context they no longer fully understood. The names shifted, the pronunciations softened, the meanings blurred, but the structure remained. A fixed sky, a wandering sky, and something that did not belong cleanly to either. By the time Babylon rose, the watchers no longer stood alone. Astronomy had become institutional. Temples employed generations of specialists trained to read omens, calculate cycles, and maintain archives. Observation was no longer a solitary act. It was a profession, and professions require continuity. This is where myth quietly enters, not as invention, but as memory compression. When precise data becomes too costly to maintain across centuries, cultures preserve shape instead of detail. Narrative replaces notation. Characters replace coordinates. The crossing becomes a god, not because it was divine, but because divinity was the most durable container available. In the Enuma Elish, when Marduk confronts Tiamat, modern readers are tempted to see conflict, morality, chaos versus order, but ancient listeners would have heard something subtler, a description of rearrangement, of paths changing, of one regime of motion replacing another. Marduk's net is not a weapon, it is constraint. In celestial terms, it resembles capture, resonance, the kind of interaction that alters trajectories without destroying the object involved. Tiamat is not slain. She is divided. Her body becomes structure. This matters. Ancient Mesopotamian cosmology did not imagine destruction as an end. It imagined transformation as redistribution, matter rearranged, order reconfigured. The sky was not a battlefield. It was a ledger. So when a stranger star appears in later omen texts, it is not treated as a threat. It is logged, timed. Compared to previous appearances, some tablets associate such stars with political transition, others with floods, others with abundance. There is no single outcome, because the star is not the cause, it is the marker. Modern science recognizes this instinctively, though it uses different language. We track near-Earth objects not because they are hostile, but because their presence correlates with risk. We monitor solar cycles not because the sun intends anything, but because its rhythms shape climate, technology, biology. Intent is irrelevant. Pattern is everything. This is where 3i Atlas becomes interesting, not because it confirms ancient prophecy, but because it reminds us how easily we forget long-term pattern recognition in an age obsessed with immediacy. A civilization that measures time in quarterly reports struggles to care about cycles measured in millennia. The Sumerians did not have this problem. Their cities flooded regularly. Dynasties rose and collapsed within memory. Survival required attention to recurrence, to slow signals, to changes that unfolded over generations rather than lifetimes. When we hear 5,000 years ago, it sounds impossibly distant. To them it was continuity. The same stars returned, the same rivers rose, the same questions repeated, though the answers evolved. If 3i Atlas has an echo in ancient texts, it is not because the object itself was known, but because its category was. A crosser, a visitor that does not stay, a reminder that the solar system is not sealed. This is not frightening, it is humbling. Modern culture often frames the universe as either hostile or indifferent. Ancient culture framed it as procedural, systems interacting according to rules larger than any one participant. When those rules shifted, attention followed. And when attention followed, memory formed. As you continue listening, notice how your own mind responds to this scale. There is no need to resolve anything, no conclusion required. The ancients did not rush toward answers. They recorded, then waited. Let yourself wait with them. The sky does not ask to be understood quickly. It only asks to be noticed. Waiting was not passive for them. It was an active discipline, taught slowly, reinforced through repetition, and embedded into daily life. The temples were not only places of worship, they were instruments. Human memory was too fragile on its own, so stone and clay were taught to remember instead. A tablet, once fired, outlived the hand that shaped it. This is why the Mol-Apin mattered so deeply. It was not simply a star list. It was a timekeeping device stretched across centuries. Each copy was an act of renewal, a way of telling the future what the past had already seen. But there is a quiet detail that often goes unnoticed. The Mawatapin does not describe the sky as static, it describes it as negotiated. Stars are assigned roles, paths are defined, zones are named not by appearance, but by behaviour. The sky is organised the way a city is organised, by function, by movement, by jurisdiction. And then, occasionally, something appears that does not fit the map. When that happens, the text does not panic, it adjusts. Later Babylonian copies include marginal notes, small corrections added generations after the original compilation. These notes acknowledge discrepancies between expectation and observation, a star rising earlier than predicted, a path that drifts slightly off its assigned lane. These are not errors, they are updates. This tells us something important about the mindset behind the tablets. The scribes did not believe the heavens were frozen in perfection. They believed the heavens evolved. And if the sky could change, then history could too. This idea carried consequences far beyond astronomy. Kingship in Mesopotamia was tied to celestial order. When stars shifted, legitimacy shifted. When cycles broke, so did dynasties. Political upheaval was not random. It was synchronized. That is why crossing stars appear so often in omen literature connected to transition rather than catastrophe. They were understood as indicators that a larger cycle had reached its hinge. A hinge does not destroy the door, it allows it to open. In this sense, the word Nibiru becomes less ominous and more precise. In its earliest usage, it does not mean planet, it means crossing point, a place where paths intersect, a moment when alignment changes. The crossing could be a star, it could be a planet, it could be an abstract marker in time. What mattered was not its substance, but its timing. Modern astronomy, stripped of mythology, still recognizes this logic. We speak of Lagrange points, orbital resonances, gravitational assists, places where motion changes not because of collision, but because of balance. The ancient skywatchers were naming these effects long before the language existed to explain them mathematically. They were not guessing. They were observing patiently. When 3i Atlas entered the inner solar system, it did not announce itself dramatically. No fire, no thunder, just a faint signal, moving fast, slightly brighter than expected, following a path that did not match the familiar rhythms. To a modern observer, this is data. To an ancient one, it would have been a question. Where does it cross? What does it intersect? What cycle does it touch? Those questions are slow by nature. They do not demand immediate answers. They invite comparison, memory, archival thinking. And that is why the tablets were never meant to warn. They were meant to endure. As you listen, imagine the hands that copied these texts centuries apart, never knowing whether the anomaly they preserved would ever matter again. They were not writing for themselves. They were writing for a future moment they could not see. Perhaps that moment feels closer now, or perhaps it is still far away. Either way, the practice remains the same. Observe, record, wait. The sky is always spoken softly. It only reveals its meaning to those willing to listen long enough. The waiting did not feel empty to them. It felt deliberate. In the cities along the Euphrates, time was not something that rushed forward. It folded back on itself. Seasons repeated. Dynasties rose and fell in recognizable patterns. Even the stars, most nights, behaved as they had before. This repetition created confidence. But it also created sensitivity. When something broke the pattern, it was noticed immediately. A scribe trained in astronomical observation did not simply look up and admire the sky. He compared it, night against night, year against year, copy against copy. His education was built on contrast. He learned what should be there long before. He learned how to describe what wasn't. This is why the so-called ghost star matters. It is not described as a threat. It is not given a mythological backstory. It is simply noted as present, then absent, then present again after a long interval. That restraint is unsettling. If the scribes had wanted to invent a god, they would have done so loudly. If they had wanted to inspire fear, they had the language to do it. Instead, they wrote like accountants of the sky, which raises an uncomfortable question. Why would a civilization capable of turning celestial events into gods choose not to mythologize this one? The answer may lie in how the tablets were used. Astronomical texts were not public scripture. They were internal documents, copied and circulated within priestly schools. They were teaching tools, calibration references, memory aids. Accuracy mattered more than drama, and accuracy required humility. The sky, they believed, did not belong to humanity. Humanity belonged to its cycles. This belief shaped how anomalies were handled. Instead of declaring meaning immediately, they tracked behaviour. They waited for repetition. They watched how the object interacted with known markers, how it crossed paths, altered expectations, or forced recalculations. Only after patterns emerged would interpretation begin. This method is strikingly similar to modern scientific practice. When an interstellar object enters our system today, astronomers do not declare intent. They measure velocity. They model trajectories. They compare it to known classes. And just like the ancient scribes, they become most interested when something refuses classification. 3i Atlas did exactly that. Its speed suggested an origin beyond the solar system. Its brightness fluctuated unexpectedly. Its trajectory cut across established orbital planes rather than aligning with them. None of this implied intelligence, but it did imply history. Objects like this are not born here. They carry memory from elsewhere, chemical signatures, motion vectors, timing imprints that speak to forces far older than Earth. To the Sumerians, this mattered more than intention. They did not ask, who sent it? They asked, when does it cross? Crossings were sacred because they connected cycles. A river crossing linked one territory to another. A calendar crossing marked the end of one year and the beginning of the next. A celestial crossing suggested transition on a scale too large to feel immediately, but impossible to ignore over generations. This is why later Mesopotamian texts associate crossings with kingship changes, social reorganizations, and periods of uncertainty followed by renewal. Not destruction, renewal. And renewal to them was never comfortable. It required letting go of stability. As you continue listening, notice how often this theme returns. Not as prophecy, not as warning, but as rhythm. Cycles do not care whether we are ready. They move when it is time. If you are listening from a quiet place right now, perhaps lying still, perhaps letting your thoughts drift, hold that image of the night sky above ancient Uruk. No lights, no engines, just stars and silence. That silence was not empty, it was attentive. And somewhere within it, a path crossed that did not belong to any star they knew. They wrote it down. Then they waited. They did not wait in fear. That distinction matters. Fear implies expectation of harm. What the scribes practiced instead was watchfulness. In the temple complexes of Uruk and Nippur, astronomy was not separated from administration. The same hands that recorded grain tallies also recorded star risings. The same minds that tracked irrigation cycles tracked planetary motion. To them, the sky was not symbolic, it was operational. It governed timing, planting dates, festival sequences, royal coronations, military campaigns. All were synchronized to celestial patterns that had proven reliable over centuries. So when something appeared that did not fit those patterns, it threatened more than belief. It threatened coordination. The ghost star is never described as luminous. in the way Venus is luminous, nor as fiery like a comet. Instead, it is referenced by position first, behaviour second, and brightness only in passing. That order tells us something. Position mattered most. In the Mul-Apin tradition, the sky was divided into zones governed by different deities, not as myth, but as classification. Stars belong to paths, paths belong to seasons, seasons belong to human systems. The anomaly did not belong, it crossed. It entered what later texts would call the middle way, the band of sky we now know as the ecliptic. But unlike planets, which linger and loop, this object passed through without slowing. It did not return the following year, or the year after that, which created a problem. Because the tablets were updated, astronomical lists were living documents. Each generation of scribes corrected, refined, and appended. If an object vanished permanently, it was removed. But this one wasn't. Instead, it was marked with a qualifier. It appears when the count is completed. That phrase has been debated for over a century. Count of what? Years, reigns, cycles. The tablets do not specify, which suggests the scribes already knew. Counts were standardized. They counted lunar months in blocks of 6, years in blocks of 60, larger cycles in multiples of 60 squared. Time itself was modular, and the longest commonly referenced cycle, one that appears again and again across Sumerian, Akkadian, and later Babylonian texts, is the 3,600-year cycle. Not coincidentally, this is the same number modern astronomers associate with certain long-period orbital bodies whose trajectories extend far beyond Neptune. To the scribes, this number was not mystical, it was practical. It represented completion, a return to initial conditions. So when an object was said to appear when the count is completed, it implied something vast, slow, and indifferent to human lifespans. No warning, no announcement, just re-entry. This is where modern discomfort begins, because we prefer events that happen to us, meteors that explode, comets that dazzle, eclipses that darken our day. But the Sumerian record is uninterested in spectacle. It is concerned with timing, which brings us back to 3-Eye Atlas. When modern instruments detected its inbound trajectory, one of the first oddities noted was its inclination. It did not arrive along the flattened plane where most solar system debris travels. It came in at an angle, cutting through established order. Astronomers adjusted their models, then adjusted them again. Small forces appeared to act on it, outgassing too weak to explain acceleration, yet present enough to matter. Radiation pressure was proposed. So was unusual composition. Nothing conclusive, just behaviour that resisted simplification. This resistance is exactly what ancient scribes would have flagged, not as mystery, as exception, and exceptions demanded patience. If you are still listening, let yourself slow with that thought. Imagine a civilization that does not rush to explain, but instead prepares to observe again. Even if that means waiting longer than a lifetime, their confidence came from continuity, from knowing someone else would finish the count. The tablet did not need to predict catastrophe. It only needed to say, "This has happened before, and it will happen again." The waiting mattered more than the meaning. For a scribe in Uruk, interpretation came second. First came alignment. First came verification. The sky did not care what humans believed about it. It only revealed itself on its own terms, and only to those patient enough to keep watching when nothing seemed to be happening. Night after night, the same stars rose in the same order. The scorpion climbed the horizon. The bull followed. The wagon turned slowly, predictably, like a wheel that never forgot its path. This regularity was the foundation of everything. It allowed the scribes to trust the system. And then, once in a span so long it exceeded memory, the system was interrupted. The tablets never dramatize this interruption. There is no language of fear, no omen of destruction, no cry to the gods. Instead, there is a subtle shift in tone, a tightening of description, a narrowing of language. The object is not named as a god. It is not assigned a personality. It is not worshipped. It is logged. That choice is critical. In Mesopotamian thought, gods were not catalogued by position. Stars were. The fact that this visitor is treated astronomically rather than theologically suggests the scribes understood it as phenomenon, not entity, a thing that passes, a thing that obeys rules beyond local cycles. And rules, to the Sumerians, implied predictability, even if that predictability extended beyond human comprehension. There is a passage, fragmentary but persistent, across multiple copies, that describes the object as touching the path but not belonging to it. The phrasing is awkward in English because the original language is precise. It distinguishes between entering a domain and originating within it. Planets belonged. Comets were visitors, but they announced themselves with tails and chaos. This thing did neither. It crossed cleanly, silently, almost politely, which may be why it was remembered at all. Most transient phenomena vanish into noise. Only those that defy expectation leave a mark. The scribes did not know where it came from. They did not speculate about intention. They did not attempt to assign it meaning beyond its motion. But they did something else. They placed it within time. They connected it to the long count, and that is where the modern and ancient stories begin to overlap. When contemporary astronomers reconstructed the backward trajectory of 3i Atlas, they found something unsettling. Its path did not originate from the chaotic cloud of debris that surrounds the solar system. Instead, it appeared to have a prior trajectory shaped by influences outside the sun's immediate gravitational domain. In simpler terms, it did not belong to the solar family. It passed through it. This alone does not make it unique. Interstellar objects have been detected before, but none with this combination of mass, velocity, and acceleration profile. None that behaved as if they were adjusting as they passed through. That word, adjusting, is controversial. It implies agency. Scientists avoid it. Instead, they speak of anomalous forces, non-gravitational acceleration, unexpected reflectivity. But ancient scribes would not have hesitated. They would not have said agency. They would have said rule. Because for them, even the gods followed rules. If you are still awake, let the rhythm slow here. Picture the scribes not as mystics, but as archivists of reality. Men and women whose duty was not to react, but to remember, to ensure that when the count completed again, someone would recognize the sign. This is why the tablets matter, not because they predict, but because they preserve continuity across silence. There is no urgency in the text, no suggestion that action is required, only acknowledgement, as if the universe itself had passed through the ledger, and the correct response was simply to note the time. Modern science, despite its instruments and equations, finds itself in the same position. We observe, we measure, we adjust our models, and we wait. The difference is that we assume novelty. The scribes assumed recurrence. That assumption changes everything, because if something has happened before, then its return is not anomaly, it is completion. And completion does not imply ending, it implies transition. Let that idea drift with you for a moment. The notion that cycles do not announce themselves loudly. They close quietly, like a door that has been open for millennia, finally meeting its frame. The visitor passes, the count resets, and the sky once again appears silent. Silence, in the ancient world, was never empty. It was full of things that had already happened. After the visitor passed, the tablets did not end. They did not conclude with ceremony or warning. They returned almost immediately to the ordinary sky, to lists of stars that rose when expected, to measurements that confirmed the world was still obeying its familiar order. That return to normality is what makes the interruption meaningful. If the object had shattered expectation completely, if it had burned across the heavens with violence or lingered long enough to inspire fear, it would have been absorbed into myth. Instead, it was absorbed into accounting. The scribes resumed their work because the sky resumed its rhythm. But something subtle changed in how time was treated. In later copies of astronomical tablets, particularly those associated with priestly schools in Uruk and later Babylon, scholars have noticed an increased emphasis on long-duration cycles, periods that exceed human lifespans, counts that stretch beyond dynasties, beyond the rise and fall of cities. This was not common before. Earlier records focus on agricultural timing, ritual calendars, and royal omens. After the appearance of the crossing star, there is a quiet expansion outward, more attention paid to precession, to slow stellar drift, to cycles measured not in years, but in thousands of years. It is as if the scribes realized something fundamental, that the sky was not only a clock for seasons, but a record of events that might not repeat within a single civilization. That realization carries weight, because it implies humility, the understanding that knowledge may need to be preserved longer than the society that records it. And preservation in Mesopotamia was never accidental. Clay was chosen precisely because it outlasted papyrus, leather, memory. A fired tablet could survive flood, fire, abandonment. It could wait. Which brings us back to the present moment, because 3-Psi Atlas did not announce itself dramatically either. It did not arrive trailing fire. It did not shatter models immediately. It was detected quietly, catalogued cautiously, debated gently, at first. Only later did its trajectory raise questions. Only later did its acceleration resist easy explanation. Only later did researchers notice how cleanly it crossed the plane of planetary motion, how improbably precise its path appeared when viewed across time rather than distance. Ancient scribes would have understood this perspective instinctively. They did not ask, "What is it?" They asked, "When does it belong?" And that question is far more unsettling, because time, unlike space, implies recurrence. If something belongs to time, it may return, not necessarily to the same people, not to the same cities, but to the same sky. If you are listening from a place where the night is quiet right now, let your breathing slow with this thought. Imagine the stars above you not as distant points, but as markers in a ledger older than language. Imagine that some entries are written so far apart that entire civilizations exist only between the lines. The Sumerians did not fear this scale. They accepted it. Their gods were long-lived. Their kings were temporary. Their cities were fragile. Only the sky endured. That worldview changes how one interprets an object like 3-Eye Atlas, not as a messenger, not as a threat, but as punctuation, a marker that says a cycle has completed. And if a cycle has completed, then another is already underway. This does not mean catastrophe. Ancient texts are careful about that. The visitor is not associated with floods, plagues, or divine anger. It is associated with counting, with crossing, with return. In later Babylonian commentaries, there is a phrase that appears only once, buried in an otherwise administrative text. It describes a star whose meaning is not for the present generation. That is an extraordinary statement. It implies intention without agency, significance without immediacy, something that matters, but not yet, Modern science, again, finds itself echoing this restraint. No announcements, no conclusions, just continued observation, continued modelling, continued listening. And that is perhaps the most remarkable parallel of all. 5,000 years apart, separated by language, culture, and technology, humans encounter the same response to the unknown. Watch, record, do not rush to explain, because explanation fades faster than evidence. And evidence, when preserved patiently, can outlast belief. The scribes of Uruk did not know who would read their tablets. They did not expect recognition. They did not imagine satellites or telescopes or interstellar probes. They simply trusted that someone, someday, would notice the same anomaly. And now someone has. The visitor has crossed again. The ledger has another mark. And the sky, as always, remains quiet. Let your thoughts drift with that quiet. Let the idea settle without forcing meaning, just as the ancient scribes did. Allow the record to exist without conclusion. The journey does not demand interpretation, only awareness. The quiet after a crossing is different from ordinary silence. It carries memory. In the ancient cities along the Euphrates, nights were never empty. Even when the wind fell still and lamps dimmed, the sky remained active in the minds of those trained to watch it. Stars were not decorations, they were intervals. Each one marked a position not only in space, but in an immense calendar that stretched beyond human continuity. When the scribes recorded the passing of the anomalous star, they did not attach interpretation because interpretation would bind it to their time. Instead, they anchored it to the sky itself. Position, motion, crossing, departure, and then they stepped back. This restraint is difficult for us to grasp today. We live in an age where discovery demands immediacy. A signal must mean something now. An anomaly must resolve into threat or promise. But the ancient observers worked within a different rhythm. They assumed that most things worth noticing would not complete their meaning within a single lifetime. That assumption shaped everything. It shaped how they built cities, knowing floods would reclaim them. It shaped how they ruled, knowing kings would fall. And it shaped how they watched the sky, knowing that some events were not messages, but timestamps. The concept of a ghost star fits perfectly within this worldview. Not a body to worship, not an omen to fear, but a marker that arrives, crosses and leaves, quietly altering the long count. In later centuries, Babylonian astronomers expanded on this approach. They refined star catalogues. They corrected older measurements with astonishing precision. They developed mathematical techniques that allowed them to predict eclipses generations in advance. But they did something else as well. They preserved anomalies. They did not erase records that failed to conform. They did not smooth irregularities. They left them intact, annotated and carefully copied. That decision matters, because without it, the memory of the crossing star would have vanished entirely. The Mullah-pin tablets themselves were not sacred texts. They were working documents, manuals used by students and priests. That makes the inclusion of a non-conforming object even more significant. It means the star was not mythologized after the fact. It was observed, and then carried forward intact, generation after generation, without embellishment. If you are listening from a place where the night feels especially still, perhaps a room with lights dimmed, or a road stretching quietly beyond a windshield, let that idea rest with you. Imagine holding a record that you know you will never fully understand, but choosing to preserve it anyway. That is a rare kind of trust. Trust in the future. Now consider the modern response to 3i Atlas. The object does not behave like a typical comet. Its acceleration does not align cleanly with outgassing models. Its trajectory intersects the solar system's plane at an angle that minimizes gravitational disruption while maximizing observational visibility. None of these facts prove intent, but intent is not required for significance. Ancient scribes did not ask whether the star wanted to be seen. They asked whether it had been seen before. And that question remains open. Because if 3i Atlas corresponds to a cycle measured in millennia, then its last passage may predate recorded history entirely, or lie buried within records not yet translated, not yet discovered, or not yet understood. The absence of data does not negate the pattern, it deepens it. In Sumerian cosmology, the sky was not a stage for drama. It was a system governed by order so vast that even gods were bound by it. The deities did not command the stars, they read them. This is a crucial distinction. It suggests that celestial events were not expressions of will, but expressions of structure, and structures repeat. If 3i Atlas is part of such a structure, then its meaning does not lie in what it brings, but in what it confirms. That the sky remembers, that not everything passes once, that some motions are slow enough to be mistaken for absence. As the object recedes, modern instruments will continue to track it until it fades beyond detection. At that point, it will become once again what it was for the ancients, a memory preserved only in record, and record, when stripped of interpretation, becomes a bridge between times, between observers who will never meet, between questions that cannot yet be answered and the patience required to ask them properly. The scribes ended their entries simply. No flourish, no warning, just the continuation of the list. Stars rising where they always had, stars setting as expected, order restored, but the interruption remained, waiting quietly between the lines. Let your breathing slow now. Let the sky above you feel wide again. The visitor has passed. The record remains. And somewhere, far beyond the reach of immediate meaning, the next crossing is already on its way. Long after the clay tablets were dried and stacked, long after the cities that produced them sank back into sand, the sky continued its slow work. It always does. What changes is the observer. The ancient astronomers of Mesopotamia did not watch the heavens for wonder alone. They watched for alignment, for deviation, for the quiet moments when something failed to behave as expected. Their entire system depended on recognizing stability first. Only then could change be detected. This is why their star lists begin with repetition. Night after night, the same constellations rose, the same intervals returned. The same planetary wanderers traced their familiar paths. The comfort of this repetition was essential, because without it, anomaly would have no contrast. When the ghost star appeared, it did not announce itself with brilliance. It did not flare. It did not dominate the sky. It moved steadily, deliberately, cutting across a region that was not meant to be crossed. That is what made it unforgettable. In modern astronomy, we would call this a high inclination object, an interstellar traveller entering the solar system from a plane misaligned with the ecliptic. But the scribes had no word for inclination. They described it spatially, relationally, the star that crosses the middle. Middle, in Sumerian astronomical language, did not mean centre in a geometric sense. It meant boundary, the dividing line between domains, the zone where order transitions into uncertainty. Crossings mattered. In the Enuma Elish, creation itself is described as a separation of domains, waters divided, paths fixed, boundaries enforced. The maintenance of those boundaries was the work of both gods and kings. Anything that crossed them carried weight. But again, weight did not mean danger. It meant record. When we move into the later Babylonian period, we see the same discipline carried forward. Astronomical diaries from Babylon list eclipses, planetary conjunctions, atmospheric conditions, even market prices, all side by side. To the modern mind, this seems strange. Why record celestial events alongside grain costs? Because both were signals, both were indicators of systemic balance. The sky reflected the state of the world not through omen, but through rhythm. When rhythm shifted, it was noted, not feared. This is why later interpretations that turn every celestial anomaly into prophecy misunderstand the original mindset. The scribes were not predicting catastrophe. They were tracking continuity. Now let us bring our attention gently back to 3i Atlas, discovered through modern sky surveys designed to detect near-Earth objects. Its identification came not from myth, but from mathematics. Subtle deviations in expected motion flagged it as something unusual. Follow-up observations confirmed its hyperbolic trajectory, meaning it is not bound to the sun, it is passing through. This alone places it in rare company. Interstellar objects are not common visitors. They require extraordinary precision to be detected at all. Most pass unseen, lost against the background of stars. The fact that 3i Atlas was noticed speaks not to its brightness, but to its geometry. It crossed where we were looking, just as the ghost star crossed where ancient observers were watching. This parallel is not proof of connection, it is something quieter. It is resonance. The same kind that exists when two instruments, separated by centuries, vibrate at the same frequency. If you are listening from a place where time feels stretched, perhaps late at night when hours blur and thoughts drift, this is a good moment to pause. Imagine the same sky above you now, stretched over thousands of years, watched by eyes long gone. The stars you see are not new. The patterns are ancient. Only the questions have changed, modern. Science asks what 3i Atlas is made of, what forces act upon it, whether its acceleration can be explained by non-gravitational effects like outgassing or radiation pressure. Ancient science asks where it crossed, how long it remained visible, and whether it returned. Both approaches are valid. Neither is complete alone. There is a temptation to frame the past as naive and the present as enlightened, but the truth is more complex. The ancients lacked instruments, but they possessed patience. They observed not for careers or publications, but for continuity. A scribe might spend his entire life copying records of stars that never changed, just to ensure that if one ever did, it would be noticed. That kind of devotion leaves a trace, and traces matter, because somewhere between the Mold-Apin tablets and modern orbital simulations lies a shared acknowledgement. The sky has structure beyond immediate understanding, not mystery in the dramatic sense, but depth. As 3i Atlas continues its outward journey, its signal will weaken, data points will thin. Eventually, it will slip beyond the reach of our instruments, just as its ancient counterpart slipped beyond naked eye visibility. And when that happens, all that remains is record, numbers, positions, notes in margins. The ancients understood that this was enough. They trusted that meaning could arrive later. So tonight, as the hours stretch and the stars drift overhead, let that trust settle in. The visitor has crossed. The record has been made. And the sky returns, as it always does, to its long, patient silence. But silence, as they knew, is never empty. The silence after a crossing was never treated as absence. It was treated as completion. In the old observatory spaces, open courtyards ringed with low walls, stair-step platforms aligned to horizons, the work did not stop when a strange object vanished from view. In many ways, that was when the work truly began. The scribes turned inward then, away from the sky, and back toward the tablets, comparing what had been seen against what had been recorded before. Patterns were not assumed. They were earned. One of the quiet misunderstandings about ancient astronomy is the idea that it was static, rigid, bound by tradition. In reality, it was adaptive. New tablets were not replacements for old ones. They were layers, additions, corrections written carefully so that future eyes could see not just what was known, but how knowledge changed. This is why the Mol-Apin tradition survived transitions between cultures, languages, and empires. The Assyrians inherited it. The Babylonians refined it. Even centuries later, Greek astronomers would unknowingly echo its structure, and always, woven through the lists of fixed stars and planetary cycles, there were margins, notes that did not quite fit, a star seen briefly, a path that did not repeat, a crossing without omen. These entries were never expanded into myth. They were preserved as facts. Modern readers often expect ancient texts to explain themselves, to announce significance, to declare meaning. But Mesopotamian science rarely did this. Meaning was something that emerged through accumulation, not declaration, which brings us back again, slowly, deliberately, to the present. When astronomers modelled the trajectory of 3i Atlas, one detail stood out almost immediately. Its path did not align neatly with the solar system's plane. It arrived from above the ecliptic, crossed it, and exited below. This matters more than it sounds. Most objects we observe, asteroids, comets, debris, belong to the same flattened disk formed with the Sun. Their inclinations vary, but rarely dramatically. An object that slices through this disk at a steep angle is statistically unlikely to originate here. In simple terms, it does not belong. Ancient observers would not have framed it this way, but they would have recognized the same deviation. A body that ignores the established paths is not just rare, it is instructive, not because it threatens the system, but because it reveals it. The act of crossing exposes the structure of what is crossed. Think again of the phrase, the star that crosses the middle. It does not say the star that destroys or conquers or warns. It defines the object entirely by its relationship to the system it passes through. That is a scientific instinct, and it suggests something important about how ancient Mesopotamians thought about the cosmos. They did not see it as chaotic. They saw it as ordered, layered, governed by rhythms that could be learned, but not fully controlled. Visitors did not break that order. They confirmed it. Now let your attention drift for a moment. If you are listening from a place of stillness, a bed, a quiet room, a long road at night, allow the image to form again. The desert, the platform, the sky, one star moving where it should not. No panic, no urgency, only record. Modern discussions around interstellar objects often lean toward extremes. Either they are framed as meaningless debris or as harbingers of something extraordinary. Both positions miss the middle ground that ancient astronomers occupied so comfortably. They allowed for significance without speculation. They allowed for mystery without fear. And this may be the most valuable lesson their tablets still offer. Because as our instruments improve, as more interstellar visitors are detected, some larger, some faster, some stranger, the question will not be whether they exist. The question will be how we respond. Do we rush to explain, to dominate the narrative, to attach purpose too quickly? Or do we do what the scribes did? Do we watch? Do we note? Do we wait? There is a humility in that approach that feels increasingly rare. It requires accepting that some phenomena are not messages meant for us. They are simply events passing through a system far larger than our concerns, and yet they are not meaningless, because meaning does not always arrive as revelation. Sometimes it arrives as alignment, across time, across cultures, across methods of knowing. A scribe presses a stylus into clay. A telescope logs a trajectory into memory. Separated by 5,000 years, both are performing the same act. They are saying, this happened, and that for now is enough. The sky remains. The visitor recedes, and the record waits patiently, knowing that understanding moves more slowly than objects ever could. So let the pace soften again. Let the stars return to their familiar positions. Let the path settle. The crossing has passed. The night continues. And somewhere, quietly, the next watcher is already looking up. Time, in these traditions, was never a straight line. It was a current. The scribes of Mesopotamia understood this intuitively, long before mathematics gave them language to formalize it. Nights were not isolated moments. Each one belonged to a sequence, and every sequence belonged to a cycle that extended far, beyond a single lifetime. This is why tablets were copied with such care, even when the content seemed obsolete. A record was never assumed to be finished simply because the event had passed. What mattered was recurrence. A thing seen once was interesting. A thing seen twice was notable. A thing seen again, after generations, became a pattern. This is where modern astronomy and ancient skywatching quietly meet. When 3i Atlas was catalogued, its designation marked it as the third confirmed interstellar object ever observed passing through our solar system. That alone placed it in rare company. But rarity was not the feature that drew sustained attention. It was consistency. Its velocity suggested an origin far beyond the gravitational influence of the Sun. Its trajectory implied prior interaction with other stellar systems, and its acceleration, subtle, persistent, unexplained by simple outgassing models, raised questions that remain unresolved. No alarms were sounded. No extraordinary claims were made. The data was logged, models were adjusted, papers were written in careful language, full of conditionals and margins of error. This restraint mirrors something ancient. In Mesopotamian astronomy, anomalous stars were not immediately classified as omens. Omens were conclusions, not observations. Before a phenomenon could acquire symbolic meaning, it had to demonstrate behaviour, repetition, consequence. This is why many tablets simply list unusual appearances without interpretation. The scribes understood that premature meaning distorts memory, and memory, once distorted, becomes useless as evidence. There is something deeply modern about that caution. It suggests that ancient astronomers were not myth-makers watching the sky for signs of divine mood, but analysts tracking systems whose logic they trusted, even when they did not fully understand it. Which brings us to an uncomfortable thought. What if some of the most valuable ancient astronomical knowledge was never intended to explain, but to preserve the unknown? Consider the structure of Molopin itself. It is not a story. It is not a prophecy. It is a manual, a reference work, a quiet attempt to impose order on an overwhelming amount of information. Fixed stars, rising times, setting points, planetary intervals, all carefully organised so that deviations could be noticed. A system built not to confirm expectation, but to reveal difference. Modern astronomy does the same thing with star catalogues, orbital simulations, and anomaly detection algorithms. We build baselines so that deviations stand out. And when something deviates, like 3i Atlas, the response is not excitement, it is scrutiny. This is the discipline that links us to the ancient sky watchers more closely than any myth ever could. Now imagine, again, that mental anchor, the night sky above Babylon. But this time, layer over it the modern image, a map of orbital vectors, lines slicing through three-dimensional space. Let the two images coexist. They are not opposites. They are the same practice, expressed through different tools. What changes is not curiosity, but confidence. We trust our instruments more now. We trust equations, sensors, and computational models. But the fundamental posture, the willingness to observe without immediate conclusion, remains identical. And this matters because much of what is said publicly about interstellar visitors ignores this posture entirely. The temptation to assign purpose, to decide what something means, arrives faster than understanding ever could. Ancient astronomers resisted that temptation. They knew that the sky was older than their stories. They knew that not every crossing was for them. There is a line in later Babylonian commentary, often overlooked because it lacks drama, that speaks of paths that touch but do not turn. It refers to objects that enter the sky's domain, intersect its order briefly, and then depart, unchanged. They leave no aftermath, no omen, no message, only a trace in the record. This is perhaps the most unsettling possibility of all. Not that Three-Eye Atlas means something catastrophic, but that it means nothing at all, at least nothing intended, that it is simply part of a universe in motion, intersecting our awareness by chance rather than design. And yet, even this does not strip it of significance, because significance does not require intention. A stone does not intend to ripple water when it falls into a pond, but the ripples exist all the same. They can be measured, studied, compared to others. The scribes understood this. They did not ask why the star crossed, they asked how. They did not wonder what it wanted. They wondered where it came from and whether it would ever return. As the centuries passed and as empires rose and fell, the memory of such crossings thinned. Copies degraded. Margins were lost. Context faded. Later readers filled gaps with mythology, as humans always do when precision gives way to imagination. But beneath the stories, the structure remained. A crossing recorded, a path noted, a silence afterward. Now, in our own time, we find ourselves repeating the same cycle, observing, recording, waiting. And perhaps this is where the true continuity lies, not in prophecy, not in doom, not in divine intent, but in patience. So let the sky remain quiet for a while longer. Let the visitor continue outward, growing dimmer, slipping beyond the reach of our instruments. The tablets do not rush the next chapter, neither should we. The work of watching has never required urgency, only attention. The night sky above Mesopotamia was never treated as a story. It was treated as a ledger. When Sumerian astronomer priests looked upward, they did not ask what the stars meant. They asked where they were, when they returned, and how long they stayed away. Meaning came later, only after measurement failed. The heavens were first a system, not a myth. In the courtyards of Uruk and Ur, stone markers were set into the ground long before the great ziggurats rose. These were not altars, they were sighting points. From them the rising of specific stars could be tracked night after night, year after year, across generations that never questioned why the task mattered. A son learned the sky from his father, and his father from another before him. No one expected answers. They expected continuity. The Mul Apin tablets emerged from this culture of patient observation. They are not prophetic texts. They do not warn. They do not command. They catalogue. Fixed stars are listed first, carefully arranged by season, horizon, and latitude. Then come the wanderers, planets, whose paths cut against the expected order. Even these were tolerated, their cycles could be learned. But in the margins of this system, there are hints of unease. There are moments where the tablets hesitate, where phrasing changes, where a star is mentioned not by name, but by behaviour, a body that does not keep time, a light that appears where it should not, then leaves without completing the circuit expected of the wanderers. It is not framed as danger. It is framed as irregularity. For the Sumerian mind, irregularity mattered more than threat. Later civilizations would mythologize such anomalies, turning them into omens of kings falling or cities burning. But the earliest records do something quieter. They simply note the break in pattern. They record the deviation and move on. as if assuming that someday someone would understand. This brings us to the second silence in the tablets. Not the silence of disappearance, but the silence of restraint. There is no attempt to explain the ghost star, no speculation, no divine attribution, no story. This is deeply unusual for Mesopotamian writing, which otherwise delights in narrative layering. Floods are explained, storms are argued over by gods, even eclipses are wrapped in ritual instruction. But this object, this crossing light, is allowed to remain undefined. To the modern mind, this feels incomplete, but to the ancient observer, restraint was a form of accuracy. To name a thing prematurely was to distort it, and so the tablets leave us with a record that feels unfinished, but may in fact be complete. Centuries later, Babylonian scholars inherited these records. They copied them faithfully, sometimes without understanding them. In doing so, they preserved not only the data, but the uncertainty embedded within it. A later scribe adds a gloss, another adds a question mark-shaped wedge. None remove the anomaly. This is how ancient knowledge survived, not by certainty, but by transmission. And transmission itself became the next mystery. As empires rose and fell, the sky did not change, but the way humans spoke about it did. Greek astronomers reframed Mesopotamian observations into geometry. Roman scholars turned cycles into calendars. Medieval interpreters folded everything into theology. With each translation, the ghost star drifted further from its original context. By the time early modern astronomy emerged, the ancient restraint was gone. Every object needed classification. Every movement demanded explanation. The sky was no longer a ledger. It was a machine. And yet, even now, there are moments when the machine stutters. Modern astronomy is precise, but it is also honest in its uncertainty. Objects are logged before they are understood. Designations come before names. A trajectory is calculated long before purpose is assigned. In this way, science has quietly returned to a Sumerian mindset. 3i Atlas entered our records this way, not as a prophecy fulfilled, not as a threat, but as a problem in motion. Its path was unusual. Its velocity did not match expectation. Its behaviour resisted immediate explanation. And so it was logged, observed, watched, just as the scribes once watched. This parallel is not mystical, it is procedural. Two cultures, separated by 5,000 years, encountering the same limitation. The moment when observation outpaces interpretation. There is a temptation, in moments like this, to force meaning, to declare that the past predicted the present, to draw straight lines where only echoes exist. But history rarely works that way. It whispers. It repeats patterns without repeating causes. The ancient scribes were not waiting for us, and we are not fulfilling their expectations. We are simply standing at the same edge of knowledge they once stood on, looking up, writing carefully, and choosing not to invent answers we do not yet have. This brings us to the final tablet, not carved in clay, but written in absence. Because what ultimately defines the Sumerian record is not what it says, but what it refuses to say. The tablets do not conclude with revelation. They fade. Records stop. Observations end. Cities fall silent. Sand moves in. The sky remains. And the object, whatever it was, passes beyond the limits of notation. So imagine that final moment. The scribe sets down the stylus. The clay is smoothed. The tablet dries in the warm night air. Above him, the stars continue their slow motion. The familiar ones return. The wandering ones trace their paths. And the crossing light is no longer there. No alarm is raised, no story is told. Life continues. Thousands of years later, we notice the same quiet departure. An object enters, crosses and leaves. Telescopes track it until they cannot. Data is archived, papers are written, then attention shifts elsewhere, and once again the sky returns to its background silence. This is not a warning, it is not a message, it is a rhythm. Things pass through, records are kept, understanding comes slowly if at all. The tablet is broken now, the city that housed it is dust, the observers are gone, and yet the method remains. Look carefully, write honestly, accept what cannot yet be explained. The visitor has already moved on, and now there is only the dark sky above you, the steady breath of the night, the long memory of observation. Rest here. The stars will continue their paths without us. And when the next anomaly appears, someone, somewhere, will look up and write it down. Good night.